Hey guys, tonight's subject sits in a world that people often imagine as polished, elegant, and perfectly mannered. But for a great many children in Regency England, respectability could be fragile long before they were old enough to understand the word. A person could enter life having done nothing at all, and yet already carry a social burden that shaped their name, their prospects, their place in a household, and the tone of almost every introduction that followed. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like really does help support the channel. If you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, subscribing is a simple way to find your way back. Now, with that, let's step into Regency England and into one of the era's most unforgiving social facts. To modern ears, the word illegitimate can sound like a technical label from an old law book, a cold bit of formal language tucked into parish records and family papers. But in Regency England, it was much more than that. It was legal, social, moral, economic, and deeply personal all at once. It could shape whether a child inherited property, whether a mother remained within her family circle, whether a father acknowledged any duty at all, and whether a young person grew up with even the most ordinary expectation of belonging. And to understand why, it helps to set aside the softer, romantic image of the Regency that later fiction would make so famous. Beneath the dances, drawing rooms, and polished conversations stood a society intensely concerned with order, inheritance, household reputation, and public appearance. Birth mattered, names mattered, and the official structure of family mattered very much indeed. What made the situation so harsh was that the burden did not fall evenly. Men and women did not suffer in the same way, and children were almost never in a position to protect themselves from any of it. The law did not treat an illegitimate child simply as a child born under unfortunate circumstances. In a very real sense, the child stood outside the standard line of family continuity. Under English common law, an illegitimate child was often described in terms that now sound startlingly severe, as filius nullius, the child of no one, especially in matters of inheritance through the father. That did not mean such a child literally had no mother or no known relations. It meant that, in the eyes of the legal order that governed property and succession, the child did not automatically belong where legitimate children did. That distinction could echo through an entire life. For aristocratic and landed families, legitimacy was bound tightly to property. Estates, titles, family settlements, and expectations of succession depended on recognized birth within lawful marriage. This was not merely snobbery, though snobbery was certainly part of it. The system of landholding in Britain relied on continuity, and elite families spent enormous effort trying to make sure land passed in stable, predictable lines. Marriages were therefore not only emotional or personal arrangements, but instruments of household strategy. A child born outside marriage threatened that clarity. Even where a father cared privately, the structure around him often pushed in the opposite direction. Acknowledgement might create scandal. Open provision might provoke disputes. Marriage to the mother after the fact, contrary to what some people assume, did not simply erase the issue under English law in the way it did in some other legal traditions. One could not neatly rewind legitimacy back into place. And this is where one of the era's quiet contradictions begins to emerge. Regency society celebrated family, lineage, and moral order, but it also created many of the conditions that left women and children exposed. Courtship was watched, certainly, but not all seduction was followed by marriage. Promises were made and broken. Domestic service brought young women into close proximity with employers and male members of households who possessed far more power than they did. Seasonal movement into towns and resort places, looser supervision in some settings, military presence during the long years shaped by war, and the ordinary imbalance between respectable male freedom and female vulnerability all mattered. So while the culture condemned illegitimacy loudly, the social world itself kept producing it. The consequences began immediately, often in the parish. Regency England was still deeply shaped by local administration. Parish officials tracked births, baptisms, settlement, and poor relief. If an unmarried woman became pregnant and lacked the means to support a child, the question was not simply moral but financial. Who would pay? Under the old poor law structure, local authorities had a strong interest in identifying the putative father, because a child likely to need assistance could become a burden on the parish. This produced one of the more revealing realities of the period. Even as society publicly framed illegitimacy as moral failure, local government treated it as a practical problem of maintenance and responsibility. In some cases, a pregnant unmarried woman might be pressured to name the father. A bastardy examination could be taken, particularly if she was likely to seek relief. The parish wanted reimbursement or support. A bastardy order might compel the man to contribute. On paper, this seems like a form of accountability, and sometimes it was, but in practice, outcomes varied enormously. A woman might struggle to prove a claim. The man might deny paternity. He might have resources to evade or resist. He might leave the area. He might pay grudgingly and irregularly. Or the mother, fearing shame, dismissal from service, or family rejection, might try to avoid the formal process entirely. So even where the system recognized a father's possible obligation, it did not guarantee security. For the mother, the danger was often immediate and devastating. Respectability in Regency England was not simply a matter of personal pride. It was a form of social currency that affected shelter, employment, marriage prospects, and family tolerance. An unmarried pregnancy could collapse that currency almost overnight. In genteel circles, it could mean quiet exile from local society, hurried removal to another town, or a carefully managed silence in which relatives tried to contain embarrassment. In working households, it could mean losing a place in service, which was especially serious because service was not just a job but a form of housing and food security. A dismissed servant did not merely lose wages. She might lose the room she slept in, the kitchen that fed her, and the fragile respectability that came from being attached to a proper household. And yet, even here, the story is more complicated than the harshest stereotype suggests. Not every family cast out a daughter. Not every mother was abandoned. Some relatives absorbed scandal privately, preferring discretion to permanent rupture. Some fathers of children did make provision, whether out of duty, fear, affection, or calculation. Some women eventually married, though the path was harder. Some children were folded, quietly and imperfectly, into wider family life. That complexity matters because the reality of Regency England was not one single response, but a spectrum of responses inside a rigid and judgmental culture. The cruelty lay partly in that uncertainty. Everything depended on class, money, kin, geography, and the willingness of others to pretend not to see what they plainly understood. Class changed the texture of illegitimacy, but not in the simple way people sometimes imagine. Wealth could soften exposure, but it did not necessarily erase stigma. A rich man could place a child in a respectable household, finance education, or provide an allowance. A wealthy family could move a pregnant daughter away before the birth, then arrange a discreet guardianship or informal adoption. Money could buy privacy, and privacy was often the great social medicine of the age. But privacy was not innocence. The record might be hidden, the gossip contained, the scandal redirected, yet the underlying distinction remained. A child might be comfortably raised and still remain barred from inheritance. A mother might be materially supported and still be excluded from the marriage market that would once have been open to her. Among the poor, by contrast, there was often less room to hide, but sometimes, in a strange way, a slightly less theatrical obsession with social polish. Poverty forced practical responses. People who worked for daily wages, crowded into shared neighborhoods, and lived close to parish oversight could not always sustain the elaborate fictions available to the rich. That did not mean illegitimacy was accepted. It was still judged, still difficult, still capable of bringing hardship and shame. But the daily problem was often brutally practical. How to feed the child, how to keep work, how to avoid the workhouse, how to secure help from kin, how to survive long enough for scandal to become ordinary life. For the child, the long-term effects could be quiet rather than dramatic, which is often how history's harsher truths actually operate. An illegitimate child was not necessarily marked every hour of every day by open cruelty. Instead, limitations accumulated. There might be uncertainty of surname. There might be awkwardness around baptismal records. There might be exclusion from the father's line. There might be no claim to family property, no straightforward entrance into kin networks, and a constant sense that one's place was conditional. Even in childhood, the language of adults could teach a person where they stood. A child learns early which subjects produce silence, which visits are formal rather than affectionate, which relatives are warm in private but distant in public. This is one of the most revealing things about the period. Legitimacy was not only a legal category. It was an emotional architecture. It structured the feeling of being settled in the world. To be legitimate was to arrive with a recognized place in the chain of family continuity. To be illegitimate was often to live with uncertainty around that place, even where one was fed, clothed, and outwardly cared for. That uncertainty could take many forms. Was one acknowledged? Was one merely tolerated? Would support continue if the father died? Would a half-sibling later deny connection? Would a future employer ask questions? Would a marriage prospect disappear after some whisper reached the wrong ear? In more privileged families, these questions could become especially sharp because so much depended on appearance. Regency gentility was built on codes of conduct, but also on controlled information. People knew far more than they openly said. A carefully phrased introduction, a missing resemblance from the family portrait, an unexplained ward in the household, an allowance routed through intermediaries, a child educated but never fully presented as kin. All of these could carry meanings that did not need to be spoken aloud. Society often operated through strategic vagueness. Everyone understood the implication, which allowed the polite fiction to survive while still preserving exclusion. There was also a gendered irony at the heart of the system. Male sexual misconduct, unless it produced a public scandal too large to ignore, could be shrugged off as foolishness, appetite, or youthful error. Female sexual transgression, or often simply female exposure to male irresponsibility, could be treated as permanent moral damage. The same society that delighted in male wit, rakishness, and discreetly tolerated vice could become merciless when the consequences appeared in the body and future of a woman. This double standard was not unique to the Regency, of course, but the period's intense concern with refinement and family order gave it a particularly polished cruelty. The condemnation came wrapped in manners, and because Regency England loved the language of virtue, it could sometimes hide power beneath moral judgment. Seduction stories were often discussed as if they were purely tales of female error, when in reality many involved deep imbalances in age, wealth, status, or dependency. A servant and her employer's son did not negotiate from equal positions. A governess, companion, or dependent relation might have very little real protection. Even where affection existed, affection did not neutralize hierarchy. A man could promise marriage and delay. He could appeal to secrecy. He could retreat behind family pressure. He could preserve his future by sacrificing hers. The law and the culture together made that easier than comfortable memory sometimes admits. At the same time, It would be too simple to imagine every illegitimate child as wholly outside affection. Some fathers cared in indirect ways. Some maintained correspondence. Some paid for schooling. Some children grew up knowing exactly who their father was, even if the world preferred ambiguity. Some were loved sincerely by mothers who endured social humiliation rather than abandon them. Some formed close bonds with maternal grandparents, aunts, or siblings. Human attachment did not vanish because the law was harsh. In fact, one of the saddest tensions of the period is that private love and public status could diverge so sharply. A father might feel tenderness yet refuse public acknowledgement. A family might cherish a child in private while denying that child equal standing. This emotional half-recognition could be more painful than total severance, because it offered glimpses of belonging without security. Literature from the broader period and the generations around it helps explain why the subject resonated so deeply. Questions of birth, name, inheritance, and female vulnerability recur constantly in British fiction because they were not abstract anxieties. They were built into ordinary life. Reputation could determine survival. Marriage was tied to property. Social disgrace could change an entire future. But fiction sometimes softens reality by focusing on exceptional outcomes, recognitions, revelations, or late marriages that repair damaged prospects. Most real lives were less tidy. Many did not end in dramatic rescue. They simply continued under constraint with smaller choices, narrower doors, and a constant need to negotiate what could be spoken and what could not. Even the church's role, which might seem straightforward from a distance, was layered. Baptism did not erase illegitimacy, but it did place a child within the Christian life of the community. Parish records might identify status in ways that preserved the distinction. Clergy could be compassionate, judgmental, or merely procedural, depending on temperament and circumstance. The church helped sanctify marriage, but it also stood at the point where private shame became public notation. A line in a register might look neutral to us now, yet for the people involved it could fix a fact that followed them for years. And there was another quiet brutality to all this. Time did not always solve the problem. Regency society was capable of forgetting many things when convenience required it, but formal birth status could remain stubborn. A successful career, good conduct, or the simple passage into adulthood did not automatically dissolve the disadvantage. For sons, barriers around inheritance and name could remain central. For daughters, questions of family background could affect marriageability and social reception. A person might build an honorable life and still find that one fact from infancy remained legible to others in ways both obvious and subtle. The past sat very near the surface. What makes this history worth lingering with is not only that the system was unfair, though it clearly was. It is that the unfairness was woven into respectable society so thoroughly that many people experienced it as ordinary. That is often how the hardest historical realities work. They are not always carried out through spectacular cruelty. They are carried out through paperwork, introductions, silences, property rules, dinner invitations withheld, surnames not passed on, and the permanent difference between being privately known and publicly recognized. In Regency England, that difference could shape a whole existence, and the deeper one looks, the more one sees that the real story is not just about scandal at all, but about who was allowed to belong securely inside the family structure that society claimed to prize above everything else. And once that question of belonging is in view, another one begins to follow closely behind. What happened when affection, duty, law, and reputation all pulled in different directions at once, and families had to decide whether to protect a name, a fortune, a daughter, or a child who had arrived in the most precarious possible place. That tension between name, fortune, daughter, and child could turn an English household into a place of careful voices and highly selective honesty, because once illegitimacy touched a family, it rarely stayed confined to one person. It spread outward into inheritance plans, marriage negotiations, sibling dynamics, legal anxieties, and the entire moral image the household presented to the world. In Regency England, a family was not simply a private emotional unit. It was also a public institution, a mechanism for holding property, forming alliances, and preserving standing across generations. So when a child was born outside marriage, the question was never only what would become of that child. The question was also what story the family could bear to have attached to itself. Among the gentry and aristocracy, this often meant that the first response was not open acknowledgement but management. A pregnancy might be hidden as long as possible. A daughter might be sent away to stay with distant relatives, or to a lodging in another town where fewer eyes knew her name. If the household had means, the entire event could be turned into something blurred and deniable. The child might later appear in the orbit of the family, not as son or daughter, but as a dependent, a godchild, a ward, a companion to an elderly relation, or a beneficiary of unexplained kindness. The vocabulary mattered. Regency society was acutely sensitive to words, and carefully chosen words could delay scandal even when they could not fully erase it. This did not necessarily mean that everyone involved was cold. On the contrary, some of the era's most painful arrangements were made by people who believed themselves to be acting humanely. A grandfather might insist that the child be provided for, yet refuse the one recognition that would fully secure that child's place. An aunt might genuinely love the little boy or girl in her care, yet still make sure the servants understood that certain questions were not to be answered. A father might pay school fees and arrange a future apprenticeship, while never allowing the child to call at his front door as openly as his legitimate children could. Affection and exclusion were not opposites in this world. They often existed together, which is one reason the history feels so uneasy when examined closely. Much depended on whether the father acknowledged responsibility in any meaningful way. There were men who maintained long, quiet connections with children they could not or would not publicly legitimize. Some arranged annuities, some used trustees, some left carefully phrased wills. Some tried to secure church livings, commissions, or professional openings later in life. But this help was inherently unstable because it depended on will rather than right. A legitimate son stood within a recognized structure. An illegitimate child often stood within a private arrangement, and private arrangements could be altered, denied, or terminated by death. If a father died suddenly, remarried, or came under pressure from his legitimate heirs, the child's security could weaken at once. The same society that admired prudence also made prudence difficult for those whose welfare depended on secrecy. For mothers, too, time did not necessarily heal the original vulnerability. An unmarried woman who bore a child did not simply endure one moment of disgrace and then return to ordinary life. Her future narrowed in ways that could be subtle or immediate. If she remained unmarried, she might have to support both herself and her child under difficult circumstances. If she later married, the child's place within the new household might be uncertain. A husband might accept the mother without truly accepting the child. Or he might tolerate the child only so long as doing so caused no financial strain or social inconvenience. Even within families that outwardly showed charity, there could be hierarchies of affection that the child absorbed without anyone needing to explain them. One of the harder truths of the period is that survival often depended on female kin. Mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, and older female employers could provide the practical protection that law and polite morality did not. A woman abandoned by the child's father might still endure because her own mother took her back in, because an aunt arranged a place in a small school, because an older widow discreetly employed her, or because female neighbors helped keep the child clothed and watched while the mother worked. This is easy to miss in grander narratives focused on legal status and aristocratic scandal, but it mattered enormously. The official culture of Regency England was patriarchal, Yet many of the day-to-day acts that prevented total collapse came through women improvising support in the spaces left open by formal structures. At the same time, the strength of kinship support could make the absence of it even more devastating. If a woman's family refused her, there were very few protections left. Respectable service could become harder to obtain. Lodging might be insecure. The workhouse loomed not simply as a symbol of poverty, but as a real institutional threat. For a mother with a child, the workhouse was not just a place of hardship. It could mean separation from ordinary social identity, the erosion of independence, and entry into a regime built more around deterrence than comfort. That possibility gave enormous force to the demand that fathers contribute maintenance. Yet enforcement still remained uncertain enough that women often lived between legal hope and practical desperation. The law itself could be both clearer and harsher than later memory suggests. English law did not provide a simple road by which an illegitimate child could be transformed into a legitimate heir after the fact. The barrier around inheritance, especially of entailed property or title, remained formidable. This is one of those details that makes the era's emotional world easier to understand. In a society where land anchored rank, politics, and identity, legitimacy was not a side issue. It was central to the machinery of continuity. That is why even fathers who cared for their illegitimate children could not simply solve everything by affection. The structure around them was rigid, and the closer one came to title, estate, and settlement, the less room there was for sentiment to overcome form. But this rigidity also produced its own hypocrisies. A man could live quite openly with a mistress in some circles, could be rumored to have children by her, and yet still preserve enough standing to move within society, provided certain lines were not crossed too publicly or too inconveniently. The child could exist and still be denied full acknowledgement. The mother could be known and still be kept outside the formal architecture of respectability. Regency England did not always demand innocence. More often, it demanded control. Scandal became intolerable not necessarily when misconduct occurred, but when it disrupted inheritance, alliance, or public order. This is a quieter and more unsettling standard, because it reveals that morality was often enforced most fiercely where property and reputation were at stake. For children born into humbler households, the legal consequences around title and estate mattered less directly, but the social consequences still shaped daily life. Parish records could mark status in a way that followed them. Employment could be harder to secure if background was questioned. Apprenticeship, one of the ordinary pathways into adult livelihood, depended heavily on connections, fees, and character references. A child whose family story carried shame might enter adulthood without the informal endorsements that others took for granted. This was not always because masters or employers were cruel. It was often because any uncertainty about background could make a candidate seem risky in a society deeply invested in moral appearances. The past became a kind of shadow reputation. And yet, here again, the story resists becoming too simple. There were illegitimate children who rose, who were educated, who entered trade, the navy, the army, the church in limited ways, or professions where merit, patronage, or necessity sometimes loosened social prejudice. British society could be rigid, but it was not perfectly sealed. War expanded some opportunities. Empire opened others. Commerce, too, could create spaces where energy and competence mattered alongside pedigree. Still, even these routes often depended on patronage, and patronage exposed the difference between kindness and entitlement. A legitimate younger son might expect help. An illegitimate one might hope for it. Names themselves carried enormous weight. A surname was not merely a label. It was a signal of place. Some illegitimate children bore their mother's surname. Some were given modified forms, middle names that hinted at paternal connection, or carefully chosen names meant to sound respectable without revealing too much. A name could invite questions or prevent them, could signal dependence, ambiguity, or quiet aspiration. Sometimes the very choice of name tells us how households tried to balance concealment with recognition. Too obvious a connection could provoke gossip. Too complete a disavowal could seem heartless or invite later claims of betrayal. Even at the level of naming, Regency families were often trying to solve a problem that had no clean answer. The emotional experience of childhood within such arrangements must have varied enormously, but one can imagine certain patterns with some confidence. A child might grow up sensing that there was a forbidden topic at the center of family life. They might notice that some visits were arranged secretly or infrequently. They might understand that a benefactor's interest could not be discussed plainly. They might be instructed to show gratitude without ever being given a vocabulary for what exactly was being compensated for. In households governed by politeness, direct explanation was often scarce. Children learned by atmosphere. They learned from who sat where, who wrote letters, who sent money, who was mentioned at dinner, and who was not. This matters because shame in the Regency world was often transmitted through silence rather than speech. Modern people sometimes imagine stigma as open insult, but much of the period's social discipline worked more softly than that. Doors closed. Invitations failed to come. Prospective matches cooled without stated reasons. A child was kindly treated but not fully embraced. A young woman was described as deserving, yet somehow not quite suitable. This form of exclusion could be especially powerful because it allowed everyone involved to preserve the language of civility. Nobody needed to say the harshest thing aloud if everyone already knew it. The punishment arrived through omission. For daughters born illegitimate, the future could be precarious in especially gendered ways. Their conduct would be watched closely, because a society already suspicious of their birth could become eager to read their behavior through inherited moral assumptions. Their marriage prospects might be reduced not only because families guarded status, but because dowry, connection, and unquestioned respectability all mattered in the marriage market. Without strong provision, many would be pushed toward dependence on relatives, low-paid gentility, teaching, companion roles, dressmaking, governess work if they were educated enough, or simple domestic struggle. The irony, once again, was sharp. A young woman might be judged through no fault of her own as living evidence of sexual disorder, and then required to maintain a degree of flawless moral caution stricter than that expected of others. For sons, the pain could take on a different shape. They might be educated just well enough to be aware of what they lacked. They might know the identity of a father whose estate, name, or political position would never pass to them. They might be given a commission, a place in trade, or help emigrating, all of which could be framed as generosity while also functioning as managed distance. In some cases, a son's resemblance to his father could itself become awkward social knowledge, noticed by others but never officially admitted. That kind of half-seen legitimacy, visible in face or bearing but absent in law, must have been one of the more delicate cruelties the age could produce. There were, of course, famous and near-famous examples across the wider late Georgian and Regency world that made these dynamics visible to contemporaries. People read scandals, traded gossip, and followed the moral dramas of the well-born with a mixture of condemnation and fascination. But celebrity or notoriety can distort the subject. The truly typical suffering did not occur only in great houses or among titled families. It lived in parish disputes, broken engagements, servant pregnancies, small market towns, modest cottages, and cramped lodgings. It lived where a woman tried to stretch a few shillings of maintenance across a week, or where a child entered service young because education and protection had already run thin. The grand scandal and the ordinary hardship belonged to the same system, just at different levels of visibility. One of the most revealing parts of the story is how illegitimacy exposed the limits of sentimental language about childhood. By the early 19th century, ideas about innocence, domestic affection, and moral upbringing were certainly present and influential. The home was increasingly idealized in certain forms of writing as a site of tenderness and moral formation. But the treatment of illegitimate children shows how conditional that tenderness could be. Childhood innocence was admired, yes, but legal and social structures still attached adult moral judgment to the circumstances of a child's birth. The age could celebrate the child in theory while penalizing particular children in practice. That contradiction is central to understanding Regency morality. Compassion existed, but it often stopped at the edge of status. It is also worth noticing that the language of reform, which would grow stronger across the 19th century, was only beginning to gather force in scattered ways. Some people did object to unnecessary cruelty. Some clergy, magistrates, philanthropists, and writers saw clearly that punishing children for the circumstances of birth was morally questionable. Some argued for greater paternal accountability or more humane treatment of poor unmarried mothers. But humanitarian feeling alone did not quickly dismantle entrenched systems. Too many interests aligned against change. Inheritance law, local financial pressure, class anxiety, gender hierarchy, and the deep English fear that easing consequences would somehow encourage vice. That fear gave hard policy a moral gloss. So a child born illegitimate in Regency England entered a world in which even sympathy could be conditional, and even kindness might be framed as indulgence rather than justice. That is perhaps the most important distinction to keep in mind. What was lacking was not always feeling. It was recognition. Recognition in law, recognition in inheritance, recognition in kinship, recognition in public identity. Without that, a life could be shaped by arrangements that were generous on the surface but fragile underneath. A benefactor could withdraw, a relative could die, a new wife could object, a legitimate heir could resent, parish could refuse, a school could ask questions. Stability rested on the goodwill of others, and goodwill was not the same thing as security. This becomes especially clear when we look at what happened as such children grew older. Early childhood might be softened by caretaking and concealment, but adolescence and adulthood brought sharper tests. Questions of education, profession, marriage, and income forced the issue of place. Who would pay for training? Who would sponsor entry into a trade or regiment? Who would stand behind a young woman seeking respectable employment? Who would leave money in a will and under what wording? These were not dramatic questions in themselves, but they determined whether a person moved into adulthood with dignity or drifted toward dependency. The older the child became, the harder it was to keep the matter hidden under the vague tenderness of infancy. And it is at precisely that point that the polite management of illegitimacy often began to reveal its limits. A hidden child could be overlooked for a while. A grown son needed a future. A grown daughter needed either provision, employment, marriage, or some place in a household. Quiet affection had to become concrete support, and concrete support forced choices that families often dreaded. Money had to be allocated. Names had to appear in documents. Relationships had to be defined. Someone had to decide whether responsibility would remain sentimental or become durable. And in Regency England, where so much depended on document, property, and formal standing, that decision could not be postponed forever. Which is why so many of the era's most tense family dramas were not really about the original scandal alone, but about the moment when the hidden consequences reached adulthood and could no longer be kept at the edge of the household, safely explained away as temporary, unfortunate, and best left unspoken. That moment, when a hidden consequence became an adult standing in the drawing room rather than an infant quietly placed elsewhere, was often the point at which a family's private arrangement collided with public reality. A child could be spoken of vaguely for years. A young man asking for a profession, or a young woman approaching marriageable age, could not remain vague for long. Regency England was a society built on introductions. Who was this person? Whose child were they? What income did they have? What future could be expected? Questions that sounded polite were often really questions about legitimacy, inheritance, and whether association carried risk. For a young man born outside marriage, one of the most urgent questions was employment that could support independence without requiring inheritance. This is why so many illegitimate sons were directed toward professions shaped by patronage rather than pure succession. The Army and Navy offered one route, though not an easy one. A commission in the Army still required money or influence, and the Navy, despite its reputation for opening opportunity, was harsh, dangerous, and hardly guaranteed advancement. Yet both could serve an important social function. They provided a respectable explanation for a young man's future while moving him slightly away from the awkward geography of home. Distance itself could be useful. A son serving abroad or posted elsewhere was easier to support than one living permanently near the family estate as a visible reminder of unresolved history. Trade was another path, especially for those outside the highest aristocratic circles. A father who would never place an illegitimate son in the line of inheritance might still fund entry into commerce, law in limited forms, colonial administration, or a partnership arranged through trusted connections. This was practical, sometimes generous, and also revealing. Support was often designed to create self-sufficiency at a distance. It solved a moral problem and a social one at the same time. The son received a future, and the household preserved its internal order. But the emotional complexity remained. To be helped in this way could feel like care and like removal simultaneously. For daughters, the options were narrower and often more fragile. Respectable work for women of gentle upbringing was limited even for the legitimate poor. For those carrying the ambiguity of birth, it could be narrower still. Becoming a governess, for example, is often romanticized in later fiction, but in reality it was frequently a lonely and uncertain position, educated enough to teach children, but not socially equal to the family employing her. It was a life of dependence performed under the language of refinement. A daughter born illegitimate but gently raised might be especially vulnerable to this path. Too educated for hard manual labor, too compromised for an easy marriage, too connected to be entirely cast off, and yet never fully secure. Companion roles, small schools run by women, dressmaking, music teaching, and dependence on better-situated relatives all formed part of the landscape. Sometimes these arrangements were affectionate and stable. Sometimes they were humiliating. To live as a permanent dependent in the home of married siblings or elderly aunts could mean safety, but also the constant awareness that one's position was based on tolerance rather than unquestioned belonging. A woman might be loved and still feel herself arranged around the edges of other people's proper lives. Marriage, of course, remained one of the central questions, and legitimacy shaped it sharply. A woman's prospects in Regency England were never based only on beauty or affection. They rested on dowry, family standing, introductions, and the quiet confidence of another family that no hidden complication would disturb future respectability. For a daughter known to be illegitimate, even if perfectly mannered and personally admired, that confidence could weaken. Some men cared less. Some marriages happened happily. But many families calculated carefully, and marriage was often a family negotiation rather than a purely private romance. The polite refusal, the cooling correspondence, the proposal that never quite arrived, these were often where social judgment appeared. This is one reason why secrecy around birth could be so intense. Families were not only protecting present reputation, they were protecting future marriages. A secret preserved until the right match was made could alter an entire life. That does not mean deception was always cynical. Sometimes relatives believed they were defending a daughter from a punishment she did not deserve. Sometimes they were preserving the only practical path to security available to her. But secrecy had its own cost. Lives built on silence are vulnerable to exposure, and Regency society loved revelation almost as much as it loved propriety. A discovered letter, a careless servant, an old acquaintance from another town, a parish record too easily found. Small things could undo years of careful management. And because reputation mattered so deeply, wills became emotionally charged documents. A will was not merely financial. It was often the final public statement of who counted. To leave money to an illegitimate child could be an act of duty, affection, guilt, or defiance. To leave too much might provoke outrage from legitimate heirs. To leave too little could feel like a final abandonment. Language mattered here too. Sometimes relationships were disguised in phrasing so transparent that everyone understood the truth without it being plainly stated. A beloved young friend, a faithful dependent, a ward long under my protection. These phrases could carry entire family histories inside them. Disputes after death were especially cruel because they exposed what had been kept private. A father alive could balance competing obligations through personality, persuasion, and selective generosity. Once he died, everything hardened into paper and resentment. Legitimate heirs might challenge provisions. Widows might defend their own children's futures. Half-siblings, who had perhaps lived in uneasy politeness, could become legal opponents. The child who had once depended on personal affection now depended on interpretation of documents. Courts and solicitors are poor places for emotional nuance. What had once been managed quietly became a matter of claim and counterclaim. There is a particular sadness in how often illegitimate children were both intimately known and formally denied. They were not strangers. They might resemble the father at the table. They might share his mannerisms, his intelligence, even his social instincts. Everyone could see it, yet recognition remained partial. This half-visibility shaped lives. To be clearly connected and still excluded created a peculiar form of social instability. One belonged enough to create discomfort, but not enough to receive certainty. Some fathers tried to soften this through education. Schooling could be a form of future-making. A boy sent to a good school, a daughter trained in music and languages, these were not trivial gifts. Education could create employability and self-respect. But even here, the difference between legitimate and illegitimate status remained. A legitimate son at school was being prepared to step into a recognized place. An illegitimate son was often being prepared to survive without one. The curriculum might look similar. The emotional meaning was entirely different. There were also cases in which fathers maintained separate households for long-term mistresses and children, creating parallel domestic worlds that existed in uneasy relation to the official family. These arrangements could appear comfortable from the outside. The children were clothed, educated, perhaps even indulged. Yet comfort did not remove ambiguity. They lived in a world structured by someone else's decision not to fully acknowledge them. Their stability depended on discretion and continuity of favor. If the father's finances shifted, if a legitimate marriage altered priorities, if scandal threatened, the separate household could become precarious very quickly. And then there were the women who never received even that degree of support. For many servant girls, seamstresses, laboring women, and the daughters of small tradesmen, there was no hidden annuity, no discreet cottage, no trustee managing provision. There was only the ordinary exhaustion of trying to keep a child alive while carrying the moral blame alone. These women appear less often in polished historical memory because they left fewer letters and fewer dramatic scandals, but they formed the larger reality. Parish officials, employers, neighbors, and kin became the audience for their respectability. Every practical decision, whether to name the father, whether to seek parish relief, whether to enter service again, whether to place a child with relatives, was shaped by the knowledge that moral judgment and economic survival were tied together. The workhouse, again, sits quietly in the background of many of these stories. It was not always entered, but its possibility disciplined behavior. The fear of becoming chargeable to the parish was powerful. It encouraged families to contain scandal privately if they could, pushed mothers to seek support from reluctant fathers. It gave local authorities reason to investigate paternity not out of compassion, but financial concern. In this sense, illegitimacy was not only a moral issue but a fiscal one. Communities did not merely judge, they calculated. This practical side of the story can feel unromantic, but it explains far more than scandal ever could. Regency England was a place where affection, morality, and money were tightly entangled. A father's conscience was measured partly in banknotes. A mother's shame could be translated into rent. A child's social standing might depend on the wording of a settlement. Sentiment existed, but it moved through material structures. That is why the era's novels, wills, lawsuits, and gossip all circle the same themes. Who marries whom, who inherits, who is acknowledged, who is quietly supported, and who is left to manage alone. There was also the question of religion and moral reform. Public discourse around female virtue could be relentless, and by the Regency period, a strong culture of moral respectability shaped how communities talked about sexual conduct. Yet moral condemnation was often selective. A woman visibly carrying the evidence of sexual transgression could be judged more harshly than the man whose social freedom allowed him to move on. This imbalance was not hidden from everyone. Many women understood it perfectly. Many men did too. But understanding unfairness and changing it were different things. Social systems survive because they feel normal to enough people, especially those who benefit from them. Some families, particularly those with strong religious convictions, frame support for an illegitimate child as Christian duty rather than social concession. This could lead to genuine kindness, could also produce a colder form of benevolence, where charity replaced equality. The child was helped as an object of moral responsibility, not embraced as fully equal kin. That distinction matters. Charity can feed a person without granting them belonging. In many Regency households, the illegitimate child was tolerated through the language of benevolence while still being kept carefully outside the emotional center of inheritance and identity. The question of the mother's later marriage could complicate matters further. If she married another man, what happened to the child from before? Sometimes the new husband accepted the child into the household. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes the child was raised by grandparents while the mother attempted to rebuild her social life elsewhere. These decisions were often painful and deeply practical. A mother choosing separation was not always abandoning her child emotionally. She might be trying to secure survival for both of them in a system that made combined respectability difficult. Historical judgment becomes much less simple when one looks closely at available choices. There is also a persistent modern temptation to imagine that love, if sincere enough, would naturally overcome these barriers. But Regency England was full of people who loved within structures they did not control. A father might love and still refuse public acknowledgement. A mother might love and still leave a child with relatives because employment required it. A sister might love a half-brother and still fear what his open recognition would do to her own marriage prospects. Love existed, but it did not dissolve law, custom, or property. Often it merely made the compromises more painful. And sometimes, unexpectedly, illegitimacy created strange forms of intimacy across class lines. A wealthy man's private support for a child could bind together worlds that polite society preferred to keep separate. A respectable household might quietly depend on the discretion of servants who knew far more than they were meant to know. A child raised between households could develop a complicated sense of identity, partly inside privilege and partly outside it. These blurred boundaries remind us that family life was rarely as cleanly ordered as the formal rules suggested. Beneath the surface of propriety, Regency households were full of negotiations. Perhaps the most telling feature of all is that so much of this history happened without public language. There were no dramatic announcements, no official family meetings, no clear moral verdicts neatly recorded. Instead, there were arrangements, quiet money, sudden travel, changed introductions, letters burned, baptism entries read carefully, place found for a child, a door that remained closed. The system worked because everyone knew how to read these signs. Silence was not absence of information. It was the method by which information was controlled. And when that silence finally failed, when a grown child asked direct questions, when a marriage negotiation required truth, when a death forced legal clarity, when a resemblance became impossible to ignore, that was often when the deepest conflict began. Because by then, the issue was no longer whether the past had happened. It was whether the family would continue treating it as something to be managed quietly, or whether someone, at last, would insist on turning private acknowledgement into public fact. That demand, for a name spoken plainly, for inheritance made explicit, for kinship recognized without euphemism, could unsettle an entire household far more than the original scandal ever had, because it threatened not just memory, but the carefully constructed future everyone else had been trying to protect. That was the true danger. Not the past itself, which could often be hidden, softened, or politely ignored, but the moment someone insisted that the hidden truth be treated as part of the family's official future. Regency households were often remarkably skilled at managing memory, but much less comfortable managing justice. It was one thing to provide quietly for an illegitimate child as an act of private conscience. It was quite another to alter inheritance, social standing, or the public story of the family in order to recognize that child openly. The first could be framed as generosity. The second looked far too much like surrender. This tension often became sharpest around legitimate heirs, especially eldest sons. In theory, the conflict was about property. In reality, it was also about identity. A legitimate heir was raised not simply to inherit land, but to inherit continuity itself, to become the visible proof that the family line had remained orderly, lawful, and socially intact. The existence of an acknowledged illegitimate sibling could feel like a threat even when no title or estate was directly at stake. It challenged the emotional certainty of hierarchy. It asked whether blood or law mattered more, and Regency England preferred not to answer that question too honestly. Some legitimate heirs responded with real kindness. Letters and memoirs from the broader period show half-siblings who maintained affectionate relationships, supported one another, and quietly rejected the harsher instincts of the system. But there were also heirs who viewed such relationships with suspicion, especially if they believed their father's attention, money, or emotional loyalty had been divided. Resentment could be practical and deeply personal at once. A younger man supported through private funds might be seen not as a sibling in need, but as evidence of paternal betrayal. A daughter given a settlement might be viewed less as a vulnerable relative than as an expensive reminder of scandal. Family affection could survive these tensions, but not always. Widows occupied a particularly difficult position in these arrangements. A widow protecting her legitimate children's inheritance was not necessarily acting from cruelty. She might be navigating the very same system that had once made her own marriage a form of economic security. If her late husband had supported children outside the marriage, she could find herself caught between moral duty and maternal fear. Every pound left elsewhere might feel like a subtraction from her own children's future. Sympathy becomes complicated here because Regency domestic life often forced women to defend structures that also limited them. The same legal order that privileged legitimacy could protect a widow's household while excluding another child entirely. This is one reason the household, rather than the courtroom, is often the most revealing place to study illegitimacy. The law tells us what was formerly possible, but the dinner table tells us how people lived with it. Who visited whom? Who was invited for Christmas? Who was introduced to neighbors? Who received affectionate letters and who received only remittances? These details mattered because family legitimacy was practiced socially long before it was recorded legally. A child consistently welcomed into the household occupied a different emotional world from one kept at formal distance, even if both remained equally excluded from inheritance. There is a quiet but important difference between being supported and being claimed. Many illegitimate children were supported. Far fewer were claimed. To be claimed meant more than money. It meant being spoken of without embarrassment, being placed inside the family story rather than beside it. It meant that relatives did not have to perform ignorance. It meant that one's existence was not treated as a permanent footnote. That kind of recognition was rare precisely because it required public courage, and public courage in matters of family reputation was one of the least evenly distributed virtues of the age. Sometimes the claim came too late. A father nearing death might grow more willing to acknowledge what he had long kept private. Illness had a way of clarifying moral discomfort. Men who had spent decades balancing discretion and duty could suddenly become anxious about conscience, legacy, and the judgment of posterity. Last-minute provisions, revised wills, confessions to trusted relatives, instructions to solicitors. These were common enough to form a recognizable pattern. Yet late acknowledgement could be its own cruelty. A child who had spent 20 years in ambiguity might receive affection when the practical possibilities of full recognition were already narrowing. Love delayed by caution does not entirely cease to matter, but it carries its own bitterness. For some children, especially sons, the question of paternal recognition could become entangled with personal ambition. A young man entering adulthood might not only want financial help. He might want the dignity of being known. That desire could be dangerous. Asking openly for acknowledgement risked being seen as grasping, disloyal, or disruptive. Silence preserved support. Honesty could threaten it. This created a strange moral pressure in which gratitude and self-erasure became linked. To remain secure, one often had to accept being partially invisible. Daughters faced a parallel but differently shaped problem. They were often expected to be grateful for quiet provision while understanding that too much visibility would damage precisely the marriage prospects that provision was meant to protect. A father might privately fund dresses, education, and introductions while still insisting that certain truths remain unsaid. The daughter was then asked to build a respectable future on foundations she was forbidden to describe. It required emotional discipline of a very high order, to accept help, to understand its meaning, and to participate in the silence surrounding it. This silence could shape personality itself. Many illegitimate children seem, in letters and recollections, to have become unusually alert readers of social tone. They learned early how much was communicated indirectly. They understood hesitation in conversation, the significance of who sat where, the difference between warmth and obligation. This kind of social intelligence was a survival skill. It also meant living with constant interpretation. One listened not only to what people said, but to what they carefully avoided saying. There is something revealing here about Regency politeness itself. Modern nostalgia often treats the period's manners as evidence of refinement, but manners could also function as a mechanism of exclusion. Courtesy made harshness elegant. One did not need open insult when one had omission, implication, and the power to define someone as almost family rather than fully so. Politeness protected dignity for those inside the circle and made it difficult for those outside to challenge exclusion without seeming rude or ungrateful. In that sense, manners were not merely decorative. They were structural. At the lower end of society, where survival left less room for elaborate euphemism, the conflict could be more direct but not necessarily less painful. A laboring mother might need immediate help, not carefully phrased moral sympathy. A father refusing support was not a matter of drawing room embarrassment but hunger. Parish intervention, bastardy orders, and informal pressure from neighbors could all come into play. Reputation still mattered, but the argument often centered less on refinement and more on bread, rent, and whether a child would become chargeable to the parish. Here again, community responses varied. Some neighborhoods were brutally judgmental. Others were pragmatic in the way hardship sometimes forces people to be. Women who had themselves known insecurity could show more understanding than respectable moral language would suggest. Kin networks among the poor were often strained but also resilient. A grandmother might take in another mouth because there was no one else. A sister might help with childcare while condemning the circumstances that made it necessary. Survival rarely arrived in the form of ideal compassion. It arrived through imperfect people making difficult choices. One particularly vulnerable group were domestic servants. Service was one of the largest forms of female employment, and it depended heavily on perceived character. A servant who became pregnant outside marriage risked not only scandal but unemployability. Employers often treated pregnancy as proof of moral failure regardless of the circumstances, and dismissal could happen quickly. Since employment often included lodging, dismissal could mean immediate homelessness. The loss of place was therefore catastrophic. This is why so many servant women lived under a constant awareness that sexual vulnerability was also economic vulnerability. Seduction and dismissal were not separate events. They were often parts of the same chain. Masters and employers occupied an especially powerful moral position here. They could dismiss, conceal, forgive, exploit, or deny. Some acted responsibly. Many did not. And because the household itself was both workplace and moral theater, misconduct could be hidden behind the very structure that claimed to enforce virtue. The servant who accused a gentleman risked far more than the gentleman himself. Regency society spoke endlessly of female purity, while often leaving women economically dependent on male discretion. That contradiction sat at the center of countless ordinary tragedies. Children born from these circumstances often entered life with fewer layers of protection. Without substantial paternal support, their futures depended heavily on maternal endurance and whatever kinship network could be assembled around them. Apprenticeship fees, schooling, even basic clothing for service all required resources that might simply not exist. Childhood could become very short. A boy might be sent into labor early. A girl might enter service young, repeating the same precarious cycle her mother had known. Illegitimacy was not only a mark of social status. It could become an inherited pattern of vulnerability. And yet there were small forms of resistance against the system. Some mothers insisted on naming fathers despite pressure not to. Some families refused to disown daughters entirely. Some fathers, to the irritation of respectable relatives, openly acknowledged and supported children others preferred to erase. Some communities quietly chose mercy over moral theater. These acts rarely overturned the structure, but they mattered because they reveal that the system was never universally accepted. People negotiated with it constantly. Even within rigid conventions, conscience could still produce unexpected choices. Literature of the period and just beyond it often hints at this discomfort. The fallen woman, the secret child, the uncertain inheritance, the hidden relation returning at an inconvenient moment. These are not merely dramatic devices. They reflect widespread anxieties because audiences recognized them. Everyone understood the stakes. A concealed birth was not just private shame. It could alter succession, marriage alliances, and household stability. That is why such stories carried tension even when spoken softly. They threatened the fiction that family lines were naturally orderly. There is also the broader political backdrop to consider. The Regency period existed in the shadow of war, economic pressure, and rapid social change. Military careers, imperial expansion, urban growth, and shifting class structures created both new opportunities and new forms of instability. A young, illegitimate son might find a path in naval service or colonial administration that would have been less available in another era. A daughter in London might disappear more easily into the anonymity of the city than in a small county town where every face was known. Change created loopholes, though not equality. Cities, in particular, complicated older patterns. London allowed concealment and reinvention in ways village life did not. A woman sent away for confinement might return with a carefully arranged story, or not return at all. A child might be placed with foster carers, relatives, or institutions far from the original scandal. Urban anonymity could be protective, but it could also be lonely. Distance from gossip often meant distance from support. The city offered privacy and indifference in equal measure. Foundling institutions and charitable systems existed, but they were never simple solutions. To place a child into institutional care was often emotionally devastating and socially fraught. It might preserve survival while severing intimacy. Charity could rescue life without restoring family. Again, the distinction between being kept alive and being allowed to belong mattered deeply. Regency society could sometimes provide the first while withholding the second. And perhaps that is the most persistent thread through all of this: belonging. Not merely survival, not even affection alone, but the right to stand inside a family without apology or explanation. Legitimacy was the formal language of that right. Illegitimacy was the condition of having to negotiate for it. Some succeeded through love, money, persistence, or sheer force of character. Many lived in the uneasy middle ground, acknowledged enough to hope, excluded enough to remain uncertain. As these children moved into adulthood, the question sharpened again and again. Was there a place at the family table or only a pension? Was there a surname or only a hint? Was there inheritance or merely remembrance? Was there public kinship or only private sentiment? These were not symbolic questions. They determined where one lived, whom one married, how one was introduced, and what kind of old age became possible. And once parents aged, and the next generation took control of estates, money, and memory, those questions often returned with even greater force, because the people deciding were no longer the ones who had created the original secret, but the sons, daughters, widows, and siblings who had inherited the burden of deciding whether that secret would remain buried or finally be brought into the open. That inheritance of secrecy could be heavier than the original scandal itself, because the next generation had not chosen the circumstances, yet they were expected to preserve the arrangement. Sons inherited estates, but they also inherited silences. Daughters inherited marriage prospects, but also the obligation to protect family respectability from old truths. Widows inherited legal responsibilities and private resentments. And the illegitimate child, now no longer a child at all, often inherited the most unstable thing of all: dependence on the moral decisions of people whose interests were not necessarily aligned with justice. This was the point where sentiment often met its limit. A father, while alive, could insist on kindness. His authority could quiet objections. He could send money, arrange visits, defend a decision, or simply make his household accept an uncomfortable reality because it was his will that mattered most. But after his death, affection became negotiable. If provision had not been secured clearly and legally, it could vanish with astonishing speed. A half-brother who had smiled politely at family gatherings might suddenly become a gatekeeper. A widow who had tolerated a private arrangement might decide that tolerance had ended with her husband's last breath. A promised future could dissolve into interpretation. This is why wording in wills mattered so much. A vague expression of concern was far less useful than a legally precise settlement. Yet many fathers, especially those trying to balance discretion with duty, preferred ambiguity. They wanted to provide without creating open scandal. They wanted generosity without formal recognition. The result was often dangerous uncertainty. A solicitor might understand the intention, but intention was not always enforceable. If legitimate heirs chose resistance, the illegitimate child could discover that years of private affection translated into very little legal security. There were cases where fathers attempted to use trusts as a solution. Money placed under trusteeship could protect provision from family conflict and preserve discretion. This was often one of the more practical forms of care available. But even trusts required resources, foresight, and willingness to confront the issue before death. Many men delayed, assuming there would be more time. Regency England, like every age, was full of unfinished intentions. People meant to revise documents, meant to have difficult conversations, meant to make things right later. Later often arrived too late. The emotional experience of this must have been profoundly unstable. Imagine growing up with partial affection, believing that some form of future had been quietly promised, only to find that death turned love into paperwork and paperwork into refusal. It is difficult to overstate how often illegitimacy transformed grief into negotiation. Mourning a father could not be separated from asking whether one would still be housed, educated, or recognized. Loss became practical immediately. Even sorrow had to compete with survival. For legitimate children, especially those raised within strict expectations of family duty, the situation could also be morally uncomfortable. A son might genuinely care for a half-sibling while also feeling responsible for preserving the estate for his own children. A daughter might sympathize with an illegitimate sister and still fear the consequences of too much openness for her own marriage or social standing. Regency morality often placed people in situations where kindness and self-interest were not cleanly separable. People could behave harshly while believing themselves prudent. They could behave generously while still preserving hierarchy. This is part of why the period resists simple villains. Certainly there were selfish fathers, cruel relatives, and calculated abandonments. But there were also ordinary people navigating a system that rewarded caution and punished openness. A widow protecting her son's inheritance, a brother resisting claims on the estate, an aunt insisting on discretion. These actions could be morally troubling and socially understandable at the same time. Historical empathy does not excuse them, but it helps explain why the system endured. It survived because it made self-protection feel like responsibility. One particularly painful form of compromise involved education abroad or removal to colonial careers. An illegitimate son might be sent to the Navy, to India, to the Caribbean, or into mercantile work connected to empire. On paper, this could look like opportunity. In reality, it was often both opportunity and exile. Empire provided a socially acceptable way to turn an awkward domestic problem into distance. A son could be supported, even advanced, while also being kept safely outside the daily visibility of the ancestral home. Britain's expanding imperial world absorbed many private family tensions in exactly this way. There is something revealing in that. The empire is often discussed through politics, trade, and war, but it was also entangled with domestic respectability. Colonial appointments, military commissions, and distant postings solved intimate problems. They created futures for sons who could not easily be fitted into the inheritance structure at home. The family table in England remained orderly partly because difficult human realities were sent elsewhere. Respectability and empire were not separate stories. For daughters, removal took different forms. Some were placed with relatives far from their place of birth. Some were quietly married beneath the family's official expectations but above outright poverty. Some were sent into long-term companion roles where they would remain respectable but socially contained. Others entered lives of genteel invisibility, always present, never central. The unmarried aunt in the corner of the family story, the capable governess who never fully belonged, the well-spoken woman with an uncertain background and no clear fortune. These figures were often shaped by histories no one stated plainly. It is also important to notice how language itself enforced hierarchy. The word illegitimate was not neutral, carried moral accusation inside legal description. It suggested defect rather than circumstance. A child could be perfectly healthy, intelligent, kind, and beloved, yet the official language attached to their birth implied deficiency before character had any chance to matter. Modern ears hear that cruelty more sharply, perhaps because we are less accustomed to legal systems that openly moralize birth. But for Regency England, the word felt normal enough to be used casually, and that normality is itself revealing. Baptismal records sometimes preserved that judgment with chilling simplicity. A line in a parish register could quietly record status in a way that outlived everyone's embarrassment. Generations later, historians read those entries as data. At the time, they were social facts. They affected how people were known. Parish memory could be long. In a small community, records and gossip reinforced one another. Forgetting was difficult where everyone had attended the same church for years. This is one reason cities felt both dangerous and liberating. In London, reinvention was more possible. A woman could become less legible. A child could grow up without every neighbor remembering the circumstances of birth. But anonymity came at a cost. Rural shame could be suffocating. Yet village life also meant known relationships and informal support. Urban privacy could protect reputation while removing the very kinship networks that made survival possible. Many women had to choose between visible judgment and invisible precarity. The Church's moral authority also created a difficult contradiction. Christian teaching emphasized mercy, repentance, and care for the vulnerable, yet parish life could be deeply shaped by respectability and suspicion. Clergy varied enormously. Some were compassionate and practical. Others reinforced stigma through tone as much as policy. An unmarried mother seeking help might encounter sympathy in one parish and humiliation in another. Institutions are never experienced abstractly. They are experienced through the people who stand at the door. Foundling care and charitable institutions reflected this same mixture of mercy and judgment. To place a child into institutional care might save life, but it often required emotional severance and carried permanent consequences of identity. Charity could protect a body while dissolving a name. Some parents made that choice from desperation, not indifference. A mother unable to feed a child might choose institutional survival over personal closeness, fully aware that she was surrendering more than daily care. It is easy to judge from a distance, much harder to imagine the hunger and fear that made such decisions ordinary. There was also a legal asymmetry around fathers that shaped everything. Society could be intensely concerned with identifying paternal responsibility when parish funds were involved, but much less committed to enforcing moral equality. A father might be compelled to pay maintenance and still never be expected to share public shame. Financial obligation did not produce social accountability. He could continue within polite society while the mother carried visible consequence. This split between private payment and public immunity tells us a great deal about how gender actually functioned beneath moral rhetoric. And yet, public scandal did sometimes disrupt male immunity. If a man's conduct became too visible, if seduction involved a woman of standing, if promises of marriage were broken in socially inconvenient ways, if litigation or gossip reached the wrong circles, reputation could suffer. But even then, the burden was uneven. Male disgrace was often temporary, survivable, even narratively entertaining. Female disgrace could become structural. A rake might recover into marriage and politics. A woman with a child outside marriage often entered a much narrower future. This imbalance shaped female friendship too. Women were not simply passive victims of the system. They were also interpreters and enforcers of it. Mothers judged daughters. Sisters protected household respectability. Female employers dismissed servants. Yet women also provided the strongest forms of private rescue. They held contradictions together because they had to. A respectable matron might condemn scandal publicly and shelter a niece privately. Social order and personal compassion were constantly negotiating with one another. By the time an illegitimate child reached full adulthood, the question of identity could become deeply personal in ways beyond money. Who was one allowed to claim? Could a person speak openly of a father everyone privately knew? Could they visit openly? Could they expect affection from half-siblings? Could they tell their own children the truth? Silence is not only social strategy. Over time, it becomes part of self-understanding. Many adults in such positions lived between gratitude and resentment, loyalty and humiliation, love and exclusion. Some chose confrontation. Letters survive in which sons asked directly for recognition, support, or honesty. Some daughters pressed for clearer provision before marriage. Some mothers insisted that fathers stop treating responsibility as a private inconvenience. These confrontations were risky precisely because they broke the polite balance. To ask plainly for justice could be interpreted as ingratitude. A dependent person challenging discretion threatened the entire moral arrangement by refusing to remain quietly manageable. Others chose adaptation instead. They built lives outside the family's official structure, relying on professional success, chosen relationships, and private dignity rather than formal recognition. In some cases, this produced remarkable resilience. People learned to define themselves beyond the legitimacy the law denied them. But resilience should not be mistaken for absence of injury. Many such lives were strong because they had to be, not because the system was gentle. The broader culture, meanwhile, kept reproducing the same moral theater. Novels, sermons, gossip columns, and private letters all returned to the same anxieties because they were central to how people understood order. Birth, marriage, inheritance, and sexual reputation were not separate topics. They were the skeleton of social stability. Illegitimacy threatened that skeleton because it exposed how much respectable family life depended on performance, silence, and selective forgiveness. Perhaps the deepest irony is that the Regency ideal of domestic virtue, so often remembered through warm drawing rooms and affectionate households, was partly built by excluding those whose existence complicated that image. The peaceful family portrait required certain people to stand just outside the frame. An illegitimate child might be loved, educated, even quietly cherished, and still remain outside the official portrait. The household could preserve its moral self-image by treating exclusion as unfortunate necessity rather than injustice. And when the next generation finally inherited both the portrait and the secret, they faced a choice that was never only financial. They had to decide what kind of family history they believed themselves to be defending. Was legitimacy a legal fact that must remain supreme, whatever private tenderness suggested otherwise? Or was kinship something broader, something that could survive public acknowledgement of uncomfortable truth? That decision rarely happened in one dramatic declaration. More often it unfolded through smaller acts. Whether a half-sister was invited openly to a wedding, whether a son's children were acknowledged as cousins, whether a widow continued an allowance, whether a surname was quietly allowed to remain, whether a place at the table became permanent rather than occasional. In Regency England, belonging was often decided not in grand speeches, but in repeated ordinary permissions. And sometimes, after years of silence, one such permission, a name spoken without euphemism, An invitation sent without disguise, a provision made without apology, could alter the entire emotional geometry of a family, because once one person was openly admitted inside, everyone else had to decide what truth they were now willing to live with, and that truth, once allowed into ordinary life, had a way of changing more than inheritance or reputation. Changed memory. Families are built not only from blood and law, but from the stories they agree to tell about themselves. Regency England cared intensely about those stories. A family's past was a form of social capital, something polished, repeated, and carefully preserved. To openly admit an illegitimate child into that narrative meant accepting that the official version had never been complete. For some households, that was more frightening than any legal claim. This is why even small acts of acknowledgement could feel almost revolutionary. A half-brother invited to dine regularly rather than discreetly. A daughter introduced without evasive language. A child allowed to use a surname that everyone had previously treated as dangerous to mention. These gestures might look modest from the outside, but in a culture governed by symbolic boundaries, they mattered profoundly. They turned tolerated existence into recognized presence. Yet recognition was rarely clean. It often arrived mixed with conditions. A son might be accepted so long as he made no claim on land. A daughter might be embraced so long as her marriage remained suitably quiet. A widow might continue financial support but insist that public discussion remain limited. Even generosity could come with invisible rules. Belonging, for many illegitimate children, was conditional enough that they learned to read affection almost like diplomacy. This produced a particular kind of adulthood, one shaped by negotiation rather than certainty. Such people often became highly skilled at managing other people's discomfort. They knew when to withdraw from a conversation, when to refuse a kindness that carried humiliation, when to accept partial recognition because demanding full justice would cost too much. There is strength in that adaptability, but also sadness. A legitimate child was usually allowed to take belonging for granted. An illegitimate one often had to perform worthiness for it repeatedly. Marriage brought these tensions into especially sharp focus because marriage forced the question of what history could be carried forward into the next generation. If an illegitimate daughter married well, did her husband's family know the truth? If they did, how much did they care? If they did not, who was protecting the secret, and at what cost? A marriage could be a form of rescue, but also a fresh source of anxiety. The past did not disappear. It simply changed its audience. For sons, marriage raised a slightly different challenge. A man who had spent his life negotiating ambiguous status now had to decide what kind of inheritance, material or emotional, he would pass to his own children. Would he tell them openly who their grandfather was? Would he pursue recognition on their behalf? Or would he preserve silence to protect them from the very instability he had known? Many people, understandably, chose concealment. Silence often travels across generations not because truth is forgotten, but because each generation believes secrecy is an act of protection. There were also cases where the father's legitimate line failed entirely. No surviving sons, no secure heir, no easy continuation of the official family structure. These moments created some of the most delicate tensions of all. An illegitimate son might be the obvious biological continuation of the line and still remain legally excluded from title or entailed estate. Families then faced an almost philosophical question. What exactly were they trying to preserve? Blood, name, land, respectability, or legal order? Regency England generally answered in favor of legal form, but not without emotional discomfort. Everyone could see the contradiction. This is one reason why stories of illegitimacy often feel strangely intimate even when they involve grand estates. They force people to confront the gap between what they claim to value and what they actually protect. A family might speak endlessly of affection, duty, and Christian morality, yet still deny full belonging to a child because property rules and social fear mattered more. The contradiction was rarely stated so plainly, but it was there, sitting quietly in drawing rooms and solicitors' offices alike. Women, especially mothers, often stood at the emotional center of that contradiction. A mother who had borne an illegitimate child might spend years balancing love against survival. If she married later, she might have to divide herself between old loyalties and new respectability. If she remained unmarried, she might find that motherhood itself became both identity and accusation. Society often treated her child as evidence of moral failure, yet that same child could be the deepest relationship of her life. Historical judgment becomes thinner the closer one looks. Many women lived inside choices that were barely choices at all. Some mothers became fierce defenders of their children's dignity. They preserved letters, insisted on education, demanded support, and resisted attempts to erase paternal responsibility. Others, under enough pressure, participated in the silence, asking children not to speak certain names aloud, teaching them caution as a form of love. Both responses could come from the same place: the desire to keep a child safe in a world that had already decided safety was conditional. There is also something important in how communities remembered these stories. Regency gossip was not trivial background noise. It was a form of social enforcement. A whispered story about parentage could influence employment, marriage, friendship, and trust. Yet gossip was also strangely flexible. Some scandals faded. Others lasted decades. The difference often depended less on morality than on usefulness. People forgot what no longer threatened them and remembered what still mattered to local hierarchies. Reputation was selective memory organized by self-interest. Class shaped this process in subtle ways. The wealthy could purchase silence, but they also attracted more attention. Their scandals were discussed because their marriages and inheritances affected larger networks of money and influence. The poor had fewer means to hide, but their suffering was often treated as ordinary rather than dramatic. A servant dismissed for pregnancy might cause brief local talk and then disappear into the vast, unrecorded labor of survival. A gentleman's mistress, by contrast, might become the center of county conversation. Both were products of the same moral structure. Only one was considered socially interesting. This difference influences how history remembers them. We know more about aristocratic illegitimacy because estates generate paper. Wills, lawsuits, letters, settlements, wealth leaves evidence. Poverty often leaves only parish records and brief mentions. But the emotional reality was not confined to the documented elite. In fact, the harsher daily consequences were often felt most intensely by those least likely to appear in polished archives. A servant girl losing employment, a mother bargaining with parish officers, a child entering labor early because no father would claim him. These were the ordinary forms of the same system. One of the more uncomfortable truths is that respectable society often relied on these quiet disappearances. A pregnancy handled discreetly, a child placed elsewhere, a woman leaving service and not returning. Such outcomes allowed households to preserve moral self-image without confronting the structures that produced them. Scandal was avoided not because injustice was repaired, but because it was relocated. Someone else carried the consequence, usually farther away. This relocation could be geographical as well as emotional. Sending a daughter to Bath, to London, to distant relatives in another county, these were not merely practical choices. They were social strategies. Distance created plausible deniability. A child born away from home could later be introduced under a softer story. Geography became a moral tool. In a world without modern communication, moving a problem physically often changed its social meaning. But distance also produced loneliness. Many women who were sent away experienced a strange suspension of identity. They existed between households, neither fully disgraced nor fully restored, waiting for a birth, a decision, a marriage, or a family's willingness to speak again. The emotional texture of that waiting is easy to overlook because it rarely appears dramatically in records. Yet it may have been one of the defining experiences of illegitimacy. The sense of life paused while others decided what one's future would be. For children raised under these conditions, loyalty could become complicated. They might love fathers who never claimed them fully. They might resent legitimate siblings and also long for their approval. They might feel gratitude toward relatives whose kindness was inseparable from condescension. Human emotion rarely follows legal categories neatly. Some of the strongest attachments in these stories are full of contradiction precisely because dependence and affection were intertwined. This is perhaps why later life could bring unexpected reversals. A legitimate heir who had once resisted a half-sibling might soften with age, especially after inheriting security. A daughter who once feared scandal might later welcome a hidden sister into her children's lives. A widow who had protected her household fiercely might, after years of distance, choose generosity instead of exclusion. Time did not automatically heal these wounds, but it sometimes loosened the fear that had created them. And sometimes the opposite happened. Old resentments hardened. New wives objected. Financial pressure intensified. A previously tolerated connection became inconvenient once children of the next generation appeared. Family peace in Regency England was often conditional on economics. Affection could survive many things. It struggled most when money and legitimacy touched the same question. The legal rigidity around titles and entail made this especially visible among the aristocracy. An illegitimate son could be brilliant, capable, beloved, and still entirely unable to inherit a title that might instead pass to a distant male cousin with little emotional connection to the family at all. To modern minds, this can seem absurd. To Regency England, it was presented as stability. The title belonged to lawful succession, not emotional fairness. Yet people living inside that system felt the absurdity too. They simply lacked a structure willing to privilege justice over continuity. This tension appears again and again in letters from the broader era, people trying to reconcile personal loyalty with institutional rules. One hears the language of duty, propriety, prudence, and family necessity. Rarely does anyone say plainly, "This is unfair," not because they could not see it, but because the vocabulary of the time made fairness itself a less stable argument than order. Disorder frightened people more than injustice did. That fear of disorder explains much of the harshness. If legitimacy could be treated flexibly, what happened to inheritance? To marriage alliances? To the predictability on which landholding families built their futures? The system defended itself by presenting cruelty as caution. It was not punishing a child, it claimed. It was protecting social order. Yet of course the child still bore the punishment. Systems often hide their sharpest edges inside abstractions. For that reason, the most meaningful acts of kindness were often the simplest and least legal. An aunt who insisted a child be treated as cousin, not embarrassment. A grandfather who chose open affection over polite distance. A brother who refused to let inheritance become emotional exile. These gestures did not overturn the law, but they altered lived experience. They made belonging feel less conditional. In a society obsessed with formal legitimacy, informal loyalty could be radical. And still, even where love prevailed privately, public identity remained complicated. A person could be deeply cherished and still never fully secure. They could sit at the table and know the table was not truly theirs by right. They could be mourned sincerely and yet omitted from the official family history written for future generations. That gap between emotional truth and public record is one of the quiet tragedies of the period. because history itself often inherits the family's preferences. Official genealogies, estate records, portraits, memorials, these tend to preserve legitimacy, not emotional complexity. The child who mattered deeply in private life may appear only as a vague phrase in a will or not at all. Silence becomes archival fact. Later generations mistake absence of record for absence of significance. But if we look closely enough, the traces remain. Unusual provisions, affectionate letters, unexplained guardianship, recurring visits, a surname almost, but not quite, the right one. The past speaks softly in these details. It reminds us that illegitimacy in Regency England was never only a legal category. It was a lived negotiation over love, duty, shame, survival, and the right to be named as part of a family. And nowhere did that negotiation become more emotionally exposed than when illness entered the house, when age stripped away convenience, and the people who had spent decades maintaining silence suddenly had to decide who would be called to the bedside, who would inherit the final words, and who, at the very end, would be allowed to stand openly as family. That bedside, in many ways, was where Regency respectability became most honest, because illness stripped away some of the elegant distance that ordinary life allowed. A man could spend years arranging his affections behind careful manners, but serious illness forced practical decisions that politeness could no longer postpone. Who was sent for? Who was permitted upstairs? Who sat through the long hours of fever, weakness, and fading appetite? Who received private instructions? Who was present when final papers were signed? In those moments, family hierarchy was revealed not in public speeches, but in footsteps on a staircase. A legitimate son might stand at the center because law expected him there. A wife, even after years of private hurt, might remain the unquestioned public guardian of the household. Daughters might manage the emotional labor of decline, letters, medicines, linens, visitors, while sons handled the solicitor. But what of the son never formally acknowledged, yet privately loved? What of the daughter who had been supported discreetly for years, whose existence everyone knew but no one discussed? Illness made these questions suddenly immediate. Sometimes the answer was silence maintained to the end. A father might die without ever publicly naming the child he had privately supported for decades. Fear, habit, pride, and the desire to preserve order could survive even the approach of death. Such endings were common precisely because the longer silence had lasted, the harder truth became to speak aloud. A confession delayed for 20 years is rarely easier in the final week. It often becomes almost impossible. But there were also moments of late courage. A man who had lived cautiously might, faced with mortality, decide that reputation no longer outweighed conscience. He might insist on a final meeting, on a revised will, on instructions that certain support continue, on words that could not be easily taken back. These scenes were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet, even awkward, an invitation sent, a letter dictated, a name spoken plainly for the first time in years. Yet for the person receiving it, such gestures could alter an entire life, even if they arrived painfully late. The difficulty, of course, was that death did not guarantee obedience. A father could express wishes. The living had to choose whether to honor them. A widow might resent a final instruction that threatened her own children's security. A legitimate heir might interpret generosity as weakness or manipulation. Servants who knew too much could become witnesses no one wished to hear. The deathbed promise, so powerful in sentimental imagination, was only the beginning of another negotiation. This is where the solicitor became one of the quiet central figures of Regency family life. He stood between emotion and enforceable reality. Families trusted him with secrets they would not speak at their own dinner table. He knew which child had been quietly educated, which annuity was not to be discussed, which settlement was designed to prevent future embarrassment. His office often contained the truer map of a household than its portrait gallery did. Respectable family history was written in letters and ledgers as much as in memory. A well-drafted settlement could protect an illegitimate child against later hostility. A poorly worded one could invite years of bitterness. Some fathers, particularly those accustomed to managing appearances, preferred arrangements that were intentionally vague. They wanted support without scandal. But vagueness is a dangerous kindness. Once the father was gone, ambiguity gave power to whoever controlled interpretation. Inheritance law did not reward sentiment. It rewarded precision. And precision could itself be a form of moral courage. To name a child clearly in a will, to assign funds openly, to appoint trustworthy guardians, to refuse the easy comfort of euphemism. These were acts that required confronting the very social shame many people spent years trying to avoid. Not everyone managed it. Many preferred softer phrases and private assumptions, leaving others to untangle the consequences. The emotional burden often fell heavily on daughters, both legitimate and illegitimate. Legitimate daughters were expected to preserve peace, to mediate tensions without naming them too sharply. They wrote letters no one else wished to write. They maintained relationships that men had made awkward. They visited quietly, carried messages, arranged meetings that could be explained as charitable rather than familial. In many households, daughters were the hidden diplomats of illegitimacy. At the same time, an illegitimate daughter might be expected to embody gratitude without complaint. If she was invited to the sickbed, she must come without appearing to claim too much. If she was excluded, she must endure without public bitterness. Her dignity was often measured by how gracefully she accepted uncertainty. This expectation was profoundly unfair, yet common. She was asked to protect the comfort of those who had always possessed what she could never safely demand. There is something especially painful in the question of names at death. Who was listed among mourners? Who wore mourning openly? Who appeared in newspaper notices or family correspondence? Who was remembered in stone and who remained only in private recollection? Death fixed certain versions of truth. A child excluded from formal mourning understood the message clearly, even if love had existed in private. Public grief was also public legitimacy. Funerals, in this sense, were not only rituals of loss but statements of social order. Seating, invitations, notices, inheritance conversations whispered before the burial. These all reinforced who properly belonged. An illegitimate child might receive money and still be absent from the formal ritual of family continuity. The exclusion could be subtle enough to remain polite and sharp enough to be unforgettable. After death came the slower work of memory, and here widows often shaped history more than anyone else. A widow controlling letters, portraits, household papers, and access to old stories could decide what the next generation would know. She might preserve evidence of affection. She might destroy it. She might quietly continue support for a child who had never been her own responsibility, or she might close that chapter with decisive finality. Her choices were often interpreted morally, but they were usually tangled in fear, grief, and the practical reality of defending her own children's futures. Some widows surprised everyone by generosity. Freed from the need to perform marital loyalty or manage her husband's secrets in real time, she might choose clarity over silence. Others became stricter after death, not from simple cruelty, but because widowhood exposed how financially vulnerable respectability itself could be. A genteel household could look secure while standing on fragile income. Supporting an illegitimate child might feel morally right and economically impossible at once. The next generation watched all of this carefully. Children learned from how adults handled hidden kin. A legitimate son seeing his father's private responsibilities either absorbed that pattern or rejected it. A daughter watching how her mother treated another woman's child formed her own understanding of family duty. Illegitimacy was not merely a private problem. It was a lesson in how moral language and actual behavior diverged. Some of the strongest emotional reversals happened years later, when half-siblings who had been kept apart in youth encountered one another as adults without the original authority figures controlling the relationship. A legitimate heir no longer under his father's shadow might choose openness. An illegitimate brother, established enough to no longer seem financially threatening, might be welcomed more honestly. Sisters separated by propriety could find in adulthood a strange intimacy based on shared understanding of what the family had refused to say. These relationships were unpredictable because they were built not only on blood, but on interpretation. Did one see the other as evidence of betrayal, or simply as another person caught inside the same rigid system? The answer often depended less on law than on temperament. Some families hardened into permanent division. Others quietly rewrote themselves through ordinary affection. History rarely records the second kind clearly because reconciliation leaves fewer lawsuits. There were also men who repeated the pattern. Sons raised in households shaped by hidden illegitimacy sometimes became fathers who created the same secrecy again. This was not always hypocrisy in the dramatic sense. Often it was familiarity. They had learned that family life worked through discretion, private provision, and careful omission. The system reproduced itself not only through law, but through emotional habit. One generation's silence became the next generation's normal. This is part of why reform moved so slowly. Changing legal rules mattered, but legal change alone could not dissolve deeply social instincts about shame, respectability, and inheritance. People did not only obey the structure, they had internalized its logic. They believed that open acknowledgement might threaten everyone. They believed secrecy was kindness. They believed that preserving household order justified unequal emotional lives. These beliefs were harder to challenge than statutes. At the same time, the 19th century would gradually begin to ask more uncomfortable questions. Humanitarian language, changing ideas of childhood, debates about poverty and responsibility, and broader shifts in moral thinking all pressed against older assumptions. People increasingly questioned whether punishing children for the conditions of birth was defensible. But during the Regency itself, the old order remained powerful enough that most change happened privately rather than legislatively, through individual choices rather than transformed systems. This makes the small choices matter more. A grandfather insisting a child be educated. A sister refusing to let a half-brother disappear from family memory. A father choosing explicit provision instead of sentimental vagueness. These were not grand reforms, but they altered actual lives. History often turns on such unremarkable acts. The law may have declared a child outside the proper line. A family member deciding otherwise in practice could change everything. And still, even with kindness, the emotional architecture of illegitimacy remained difficult. To grow up loved but not fully named is a peculiar experience. It teaches both intimacy and caution. It creates gratitude sharpened by awareness of what gratitude is covering. It can produce fierce loyalty to people who never gave complete security. It can also produce a lifelong sensitivity to exclusion, to the tiny social signals by which belonging is granted or withheld. This is why so many stories of Regency illegitimacy feel less like dramatic scandal and more like quiet weather, constant, shaping, sometimes invisible to outsiders, but always present. It was there in introductions, in wills, in marriages, in Christmas invitations, in school fees, in who was mentioned and who was not. It was not one event. It was a structure of daily life. Perhaps the most revealing detail of all is how often the people involved tried not to speak in absolutes. Few said openly, "This child is family," or "This child is not." Instead, there were arrangements that hovered in between. enough affection to ease conscience, enough distance to preserve respectability, enough money to prevent open disgrace, not enough recognition to create equality. Regency England was extraordinarily skilled at building these middle spaces, where moral responsibility could be partially met without social order being fully challenged. But middle spaces are unstable. Eventually someone marries, someone dies, someone asks direct questions, someone needs money, someone resembles someone too clearly, someone finds a letter. Time presses hidden truths toward the surface. Families could delay reckoning, but rarely avoid it forever. And often the final reckoning came not in court or public scandal, but in something quieter. An adult child standing in a familiar doorway, no longer willing to be treated as a charitable obligation, but asking calmly, plainly, and perhaps for the first time, to be recognized not as a secret to be managed, but as a son, a daughter, a sister, a brother, and part of the family history that everyone else had spent years pretending was simpler than it truly was. That request for plain recognition, rather than careful charity, was often the moment Regency families feared most, because it forced everyone to stop pretending that silence was neutral. Charity could be offered from above. Recognition required equality of a kind, or at least the admission that the person standing there was not merely a problem to be managed, but part of the household's true moral history. It asked not only for money or courtesy, but for narrative honesty. And narrative honesty was expensive. A son asking to be acknowledged as a son threatened more than inheritance papers. He threatened the emotional arrangement by which everyone else had remained comfortable. If he had been educated, supported, and treated kindly, some relatives might genuinely believe he had already received enough. Gratitude, in their minds, should have replaced claim. To ask for more could be interpreted as ingratitude, ambition, even aggression. This was one of the cruelest features of the system. The person denied full belonging was often expected to protect the feelings of those who had denied it. A daughter faced a similarly delicate trap. If she sought clearer recognition, she risked being judged not only socially but morally. Women were expected to be graceful, restrained, and tactful. Pressing a claim could make her seem improper, regardless of justice. She might be told that discretion was in everyone's best interest, that the past was unfortunate but settled, that peace mattered more than precision. In effect, she was asked to cooperate in her own historical disappearance. Some did. Survival often required it. A woman depending on family goodwill for housing, employment, or marriage introductions could not easily afford confrontation. She learned the art of strategic acceptance, taking what security was offered without asking the question that might make the offer vanish. This was not weakness. It was often a clear-eyed understanding of how power actually worked. Others refused the arrangement. They wrote letters. They pressed for answers. They sought legal advice where possible. They asked fathers to sign names, brothers to honor promises, widows to continue settlements, relatives to stop using euphemisms for relationships everyone already understood. These confrontations were rarely theatrical. They were often formal, polite, and devastating precisely because they used the language of family against the structure of denial. A carefully worded letter asking for justice could be more threatening than open anger. The responses varied. Some relatives, when forced to choose, chose decency. They admitted what everyone knew. They made practical provision without resentment. They allowed kinship to become public fact rather than private embarrassment. Others retreated further into propriety, insisting that moral order depended on preserving distinctions. They would help, perhaps, but only on terms that kept hierarchy intact. Recognition remained rationed. Sometimes the conflict centered on a surname, which sounds small until one understands what names meant. A surname was not only identification, it was a passport into memory. To carry a father's name openly was to claim continuity. To be denied it was to be kept permanently adjacent to one's own history. Some illegitimate children used modified names, maternal names, or socially convenient compromises. Others quietly pushed for more. A name on a letter, a school register, a marriage settlement. These details could carry emotional force far beyond paperwork. This became especially sensitive when grandchildren appeared. The next generation complicated everything. If an illegitimate son had children of his own, were they to be treated as family? Would cousins be allowed to know one another naturally? Or would another generation inherit polite distance? Grandchildren often softened older hostilities because children make abstractions harder to maintain. It is one thing to exclude an adult whose existence recalls scandal. It is another to explain coldness toward a child who simply wants to understand why some cousins are embraced and others are treated like guests. Grandparents, particularly aging fathers, could become unexpectedly tender at this stage. The moral arithmetic changed with age. A man who had spent decades protecting his public reputation might find himself less interested in county opinion and more troubled by private regret. A grandchild's face could collapse years of abstraction. What once looked like a dangerous social complication now looked like time running out. Some of the most sincere acts of recognition happened late, not because conscience suddenly appeared, but because mortality made performance feel less convincing. But lateness had consequences. Recognition delayed until old age often arrived after damage had already settled into personality. A son who had spent 30 years being treated as peripheral did not instantly become secure because an elderly father finally spoke plainly. A daughter shaped by decades of careful exclusion could not easily relax into belonging. The system trained people in caution. Even kindness, when it arrived, had to pass through suspicion. There were also families where the opposite happened. Age made people harder. Old resentments calcified. A legitimate heir who once tolerated an arrangement might become stricter once his own children's futures came into view. A new wife entering the family could reinterpret old obligations as threats to her branch of the household. Respectability is often most fiercely defended by those who feel it could still be lost. Security does not always produce generosity. Sometimes it produces sharper boundaries. This is especially visible in second marriages. A widower with legitimate children from one marriage and an illegitimate child from before or outside it created a complicated emotional map. A second wife might be asked to accept obligations she had not chosen. Her sympathy might be genuine, but her priorities were immediate. Her own children, her own financial stability, her own place in a household already carrying unresolved history. Historians sometimes judge these women harshly, but they too were navigating a system where security for women was never guaranteed. Marriage settlements reveal much of this tension. They were practical documents, but also moral ones. Who was provided for before a marriage took place signaled what kind of responsibility was acknowledged. A father arranging a legitimate daughter's marriage while quietly neglecting an older illegitimate child was making more than a financial choice. He was assigning legitimacy not only in law, but in emotional value. Families understood these signals perfectly, even when they never said so aloud. And then there was the role of servants, who are often treated as background figures in grand households, but who, in truth, were custodians of family memory. Servants knew who visited privately, who received letters through side entrances, which child was sent away and why. They watched arrangements form and decay across decades. Their discretion was essential to respectable life. A household's moral order often depended on people without social power maintaining silence about the people who had it. This created another irony. Families obsessed with bloodline and legitimacy often relied on the loyalty of servants to preserve the very fictions that upheld those distinctions. A nursemaid might know more about a child's parentage than a future son-in-law did. A longtime housekeeper might understand the true emotional map of the family better than its official genealogist. Respectability was supported from below by people who were expected never to name what they knew. The church registers, by contrast, named things with cold efficiency. Baptisms, marriages, burials. These records created a parallel truth to the one spoken in drawing rooms. A person could be loved privately and still remain marked in public record by a single word. For historians, these registers are evidence. For the people involved, they were social permanents. One cannot gossip away a written parish fact. That permanence gave some women reason to seek secrecy before birth at almost any cost. This is why confinement away from home became such a familiar strategy. A woman sent to relatives or lodgings elsewhere could return with a story better suited to local memory. Sometimes the child was raised as a younger sibling, sometimes as a dependent, sometimes elsewhere entirely. These arrangements were not unique to the elite, though wealth made them easier. They reveal how intensely communities valued the appearance of orderly family life, and how much effort went into preserving that appearance. Yet, preserving appearances could fracture private relationships permanently. Mothers separated from children for the sake of respectability carried wounds that records rarely show. A child raised believing an aunt was a mother or a grandmother was merely a guardian might later discover the truth not as sentimental revelation, but as destabilizing loss. Identity rearranged late in life can feel like grief. Regency secrecy often postponed pain rather than preventing it. One of the most interesting expectation reversals here is that illegitimacy did not always produce the deepest cruelty where society was most openly moralistic. Sometimes the harsher experiences came in polished, respectable households where everything was handled correctly, kindly, and coldly. A poor community might judge openly and still help practically. A wealthy family might provide comfort and never grant emotional equality. Hardship and tenderness did not divide neatly by class. Sometimes the child in the grand house felt a sharper form of exclusion precisely because affection was so close and never complete. This helps explain why literature of the broader period is full of characters who seem haunted by uncertain place rather than outright abandonment. The emotional pain lies not only in being unloved, but in being almost included. To dine with the family but never fully belong. To be educated for a world that will still ask quiet questions about one's name. To be told one is cared for while understanding that care depends on everyone avoiding the central truth. That ambiguity could shape an entire temperament. And because so much of Regency life depended on introductions, the question returned again and again in social ritual. At assemblies, dinners, church, visits, marriages, how was a person presented? Not simply by title, but by relation. Niece, ward, family friend, cousin, companion. These words were social architecture. A single choice could protect or expose. People learned to hear what was missing. To be introduced without clear relation was itself a form of information. There were, of course, rare cases of open defiance. Men who acknowledged children openly, women who refused to disappear, families who simply chose affection over propriety. Such stories attracted attention precisely because they were unusual. They remind us that the system was strong but not absolute. Human beings kept testing its boundaries. Some did so out of love, some out of stubbornness, some because hypocrisy finally became intolerable. Their lives unsettled the comfortable assumption that legitimacy alone defined family. Still, most people lived in compromise. They did not overthrow the structure. They navigated it. They made peace where they could, accepted partial truths, and tried to build ordinary happiness inside imperfect arrangements. This is perhaps the most historically honest ending to most individual stories. Not dramatic exposure, but long coexistence with unresolved facts. Yet unresolved facts have a way of resurfacing. A marriage proposal prompts questions. A death opens papers. A resemblance becomes impossible to ignore. A grown child asks for answers. A grandchild innocently asks why certain cousins visit by the side door. Time keeps pressing on the same weak places until someone must decide whether the family will continue living by omission, or whether it will finally allow the hidden branch of its own history to stand in daylight. And when that moment came, it was rarely about law alone. It was about whether love, once stripped of convenience, was strong enough to survive honesty, and whether a society built on the discipline of legitimacy could bear to admit how many of its most intimate loyalties had always existed just outside the official line. And perhaps that is where the real story of illegitimacy in Regency England finally settles. Not in scandal, not in courtrooms, and not even in the dramatic language of inheritance law, but in that quieter question of what counted as family when comfort and honesty could no longer live separately. For all the formal language of legitimacy, for all the parish records and marriage settlements and carefully guarded drawing rooms, most people experienced this history not as theory, but as ordinary emotional life. It was the aunt who was kind but never fully direct. The father who paid school fees but avoided certain conversations. The half-brother who wrote warmly in private and cautiously in public. The mother who carried both love and shame in the same silence. The child who learned very early how to read a room before speaking. That is what made the system so powerful. It did not only live in law. It lived in habits, in pauses, in introductions, in who sat at the table and who was spoken of afterward. It lived in the difference between affection and acknowledgement. Regency England liked to imagine itself as a world of order, of proper marriages, clear inheritance, moral households, and visible respectability. But beneath that polished surface was something far less tidy. Families full of private negotiations, hidden loyalties, reluctant kindness, strategic silences, and children asked to carry consequences they had never created. The ideal of perfect domestic order often depended on excluding the very people who revealed how fragile that order really was. And yet, for all its cruelty, the story is not only one of rejection. There were fathers who tried, even imperfectly, mothers who fought quietly and fiercely, sisters who refused to let a sibling disappear into euphemism, grandparents who chose tenderness over propriety, servants who protected secrets out of loyalty rather than fear. Small acts of recognition mattered because they interrupted a system built on partial belonging. Sometimes the greatest kindness was not money, though money mattered. It was the simple refusal to pretend, a name spoken plainly, a seat offered without embarrassment, a letter signed honestly, a child introduced not as a charitable responsibility, but as family. Those gestures did not rewrite inheritance law. They did not erase the injustice of the structure, but they changed lived experience. They told someone who had spent years standing near the threshold that they were, at last, allowed inside. And perhaps that is why this history still feels so familiar. Because even now, people understand the difference between being helped and being claimed, between being tolerated and being welcomed, between being present in someone's life and being fully acknowledged within it. The Regency called the issue legitimacy, but beneath that old legal word was a much older human need, the desire to belong without apology, to be born and not have to negotiate one's right to be loved, to be known without being managed, to be remembered without footnotes. That was the brutal reality for many born illegitimate in Regency England. Not simply poverty, though there was often poverty. Not simply shame, though there was certainly shame. But the lifelong uncertainty of standing close enough to family to feel its warmth, while never being entirely sure whether the door was truly open. And in the end, history asks us to look at that uncertainty honestly. Not to flatten it into villains and victims alone, but to understand how ordinary respectability could produce extraordinary loneliness, how polished manners could hide deep unfairness, how people could love sincerely and still fail one another because the world around them taught them that order mattered more than justice. If there is a final lesson here, it may be this. Societies often reveal themselves most clearly in how they treat those who arrive without protection, those who did nothing wrong, yet begin life already carrying someone else's moral burden. Regency England measured legitimacy in law and name, but perhaps the truer measure of a family was always simpler. Who was called when illness came? Who was named in the will? Who was welcomed at the table? And who, when all the polite fictions finally fell away, was allowed to be called, without hesitation, without explanation, and without shame, home? If this part of history surprised you most in its quietness rather than its scandal, I'd be curious to know. What detail felt hardest to imagine living through? The silence, the uncertainty, or the way kindness itself could come with conditions? And if you enjoy these slower, deeper journeys into the past, subscribe and come back for the next one. There is always another hidden corner of history waiting, just beneath the polished surface.